The pyramids rise like miracles in the desert, but their stones are heavy with a silence history rarely tells. Imagine a teenage girl, chained, nameless, dragged from her village, her body tested like cattle, her cries mocked in the streets of Thebes. She does not know she will grind grain until her knees lock forever, or that her daughter will inherit her chains like a curse. Egypt carved her suffering out of memory, yet her bones still speak. Behind every golden mask, every temple pillar lies a story of erased women whose agony made eternity possible. The rope sears, skin blisters. A Nubian girl stumbles through Thebes' dust with a throat so dry it grinds like stone. They will not write her name, only female, young, suitable, and the line behind her is all that remains of a village. 3 days from now she'll be sold. 40 years from now her knees will no longer straighten. 3,000 years from now, bones will tell the truth Egypt refused to write. Before the gold, the gods, the glory, there was her. The rope burns through skin that has never known chains. A Nubian teenager stumbles in the Egyptian heat, every swallow like stones grinding in a dry mill. She is 15 summers old, but the scribe who watches won't bother with summers or names. He writes only, female, young, suitable. Behind her trails the ruin of a village, her mother, her aunts, a younger sister who still sobs though no tears remain. The year is 1450 BCE. Thutmose III has returned from his 8th campaign into Nubia. His boasts will carve $7,000 captives into temple walls, numbers that glitter in sandstone while the girl at the front of the line bleeds into dust that coats her arms. Cakes with blood where soldiers pinched and prodded to test for firmness. In the streets of Thebes, people gather to stare. They don't see a person. They see walking wealth, prestige on a rope, the pharaoh's power made flesh. Children fling date pits. Women spit. Men measure her body with the same cool appraisal they bring to cattle. She does not know that in 3 days she'll be sold to a noble household. She does not know about the grainstones that will bend her knees until they fuse. About the noble's son who will make a daughter who inherits her mother's chain. She does not know her bones will vanish into an unmarked pit, denied the afterlife Egypt cherished more than life itself. She only knows thirst, exhaustion, and the moment freedom ended, bronze against Nubian shields. Here is what your textbooks skip while praising pyramids and masks. Egypt's magnificence stood on the backs of enslaved women. Their lives survive in fragments, a tax note here. A skeleton with joints ground to powder there. A relief of bound women kneeling before great kings whose greatness required silence. Conservative estimates say as much as 1/3 of New Kingdom Egypt was enslaved. Most of them women. Captives from wars. Locals sold for debt. Children born into bondage. They ground the bread, wove the linen, and bled into the mortar of monuments. And Egypt didn't just chain bodies. It engineered a system to break spirits, erasing identities so completely that the pain of property was unworthy of ink. War in Egypt wasn't only for land or glory. It was a shopping trip for human lives, and women were the preferred merchandise. When Amenhotep II returned from Syria in 1420 BCE, his victory stela didn't just list conquered towns or plundered gold. It itemized people. Thousands of women by origin tallied like harvest. Ahiyawa here, Shasu there, Canaanite cities in columns. Not soldiers. Mothers, daughters, sisters harvested. The army had perfected capture. After enemy lines broke, specialized squads swept through villages with practiced calm. Women were targeted, easier to transport, less likely to revolt, more profitable at sale. Young fetched the highest price. Pregnant women were bonuses, 2 bodies for the cost of 1 chain. The elderly who couldn't march were killed where they fell, lessons left for those who could still walk. Selection was clinical and public. Captives were lined up for inspection, teeth pried to guess age, shoulders squeezed to judge labor, breasts examined for milk. Naked sorted under the eyes of their own families, domestic servants, field hands, concubines, temple staff. The humiliation was part of the design. Shatter the person before the chain hardens. On temple walls at Medinet Habu, you can still see the pride of it. Rows of bound women kneeling before Ramesses III, arms tied so tight the pose itself promises nerve damage. Children cling to legs they cannot follow. Faces are carved with foreign features, otherness turned into license. The march south finished what the muster began. Ropes at the neck made human chains. One stumble, everyone chokes. No allowances for bodies that bleed or bodies that nurse. Fall behind and the column keeps time without you. At Deir el-Medina, the village that built the royal tombs, records note the arrivals, paraded through towns, displayed like trophies, mocked and assaulted by crowds invited to feel superior. Markets ran with frightening efficiency. Price lists circulated. A young Syrian might bring 2 debans of silver. A Nubian girl, more if she showed rare skill, weaving, languages, music. Abilities raised value and sharpened the tools of exploitation. Families were deliberately scattered. Mothers sold apart from daughters, sisters split between cities because memory, kept together, becomes resistance. The vocabulary itself betrayed the policy. Slave terms that echoed orphanhood and isolation, but purchase was only prologue. What came next inside estates, temples, and fields would make death look merciful, and turn days into instruments of slow undoing. Every morning, before Ra's first light kissed the pyramids, enslaved women were already breaking their bodies for masters who saw them as tools with appetites. Grain alone consumed lives. Egypt's bread, offered to gods, fed to nobles, was ground by kneeling women pushing stones heavier than children for 12, 14, even 16 hours a day. The motion carved grooves into bone. Skeletons of women in their 20s reveal joints as ruined as modern elders in their 80s. Vertebrae fused, knees locked at right angles, their bodies literally reshaped into grinding machines. Archaeologists know this not from papyrus accounts, those rarely mention slaves, but from bones. Female remains in workers' cemeteries show spines compressed from loads no human should bear, teeth flattened from flour dust laced with grit, arm bones warped by endless repetition. The skeletons tell stories Egyptians refused to write. Water duties left different scars. Clay jars weighing 60 pounds balanced on heads mile after mile, climbing steep Nile banks. Pressure crushed neck vertebrae, leaving women with permanent forward bends, crippling headaches, sometimes paralysis. Tomb paintings even capture the posture. Women walking with necks thrust forward, etched into eternity by artists who never named them. And this was just the ordinary work. Laws gave masters full rights to punish. Papyrus Brooklyn lists accepted torments. Beatings with rods, lashes with hippopotamus hide whips, forced labor until collapse. Female slaves could be beaten for spilling water, burning bread, or simply existing too close to an angry hand. Fire scars from kitchens, chemical burns from natron in laundry, disease from stables. Every task carried dangers deliberately shifted onto enslaved women so free Egyptians never had to face them. In the tomb of Rekhmir, vizier to Thutmose III, wall paintings show luxury feasts, guests reclining, servants hovering. Look closer. Kneeling women frozen with fans and sandals, bodies bent in postures no feast would ever release. Those images were meant to ensure Rekhmir's comfort in the afterlife, but they also accidentally documented the exhaustion of women whose only role was to make his eternity pleasant. And if daily labor destroyed bodies, another demand cut even deeper: the textile industry. Egypt's pride that devoured lungs, skin, and fingers until women's lives unraveled thread by thread. Textiles, Egypt's linen, prized across the ancient world, came at a cost measured in women's bodies. Flax had to be beaten, soaked, spun, and woven. Each step meant a new form of pain. Women pounded dry stalks with mallets until fibers loosened. Clouds of dust coating lungs and sowing lifelong disease. They soaked flax in water mixed with urine to soften it, standing ankle-deep in rot. Their skin burned raw by the caustic mix. Then came spinning, thread drawn until fingers bled, and finally the loom, where women held tense positions for hours, backs screaming, hands cramping, shoulders swelling. Papyrus records show how expendable these lives were. At Deir el-Medina, a tomb painter casually complained that his allocated slave woman had died after only 3 years of work. He requested a replacement, noting her inefficiency in the final months. No name, no age, no story. Just another tool broken too soon. Fields brought no mercy either. During harvest, enslaved women bent from dawn to dusk under the sun, gleaning scraps after men reaped the main stalks. Over time, spines curved permanently. When fields flooded, women were reassigned to quarries or gold mines. Few returned. Their bodies were consumed by dust, collapse, and silence. Medical papyri treated slaves only if they still had value. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts, includes remedies for keeping workers functional. Not comfortable, not healed, functional. A broken bone might be set if the slave was expensive. Infections treated if they threatened a household. Chronic pain? Simply part of the cost of ownership. And when years of toil finally broke them, most women weren't released by death with dignity. The elderly were excess property. Some abandoned in deserts, others sealed in storage rooms to starve, their final cries muffled by stone walls. The lucky ones might train new slaves, passing on both skills and trauma. But even this endless labor wasn't the darkest fate. For some women, their value wasn't measured in muscles or hands, it was in their bodies themselves. What Egypt called honor was, in truth, a life sentence of sexual servitude disguised as privilege. Egyptian records never used words like rape or abuse. They used words like taking, enjoying, using. Language that reduced enslaved women's humanity to function. The Amarna letters, diplomatic exchanges between pharaohs and foreign kings, discuss women with the same tone as shipments of gold. One Babylonian ruler even complained that the women Egypt sent were not attractive enough. Another king offered his daughter and hundreds of female servants as treaty currency. These weren't brides or staff. They were human property passed between men like ornaments. Inside the royal harem, the reality was worse. Forget the fantasy of luxury. The harem was an institution of control and sexual exploitation. Official rolls from Ramesses III's reign list 416 foreign women, catalogued by origin with bureaucratic precision: 93 Syrians, 42 Nubians, 31 Libyans. They were called ornaments, breathing objects ranked for beauty and obedience. They could not refuse. They could not protect their daughters. And when Pharaoh died, many were handed to his successor like furniture. But this system extended far beyond palaces. Any man wealthy enough to purchase women could use them sexually without consequence. Ancient wisdom texts even advised men to plant their seed widely, a metaphor masking normalized assault. In temples, the abuse was reframed as worship. At Karnak's Temple of Mut, foreign women served as musicians or sacred servants, required to provide sexual services during festivals. Tattoos marked them as divine property, binding them to exploitation even if freed. Children born from this violence inherited slavery automatically. The law was clear. If the mother was enslaved, so was the child, no matter who the father was, even if he was the master himself. A nobleman could violate a slave, sell his own offspring, and profit twice from the crime. Some women were purchased only for fertility, their wombs treated as factories. Contracts even specified how children born from such arrangements belonged legally to the master's wife. And the abuse wasn't private. Enslaved women were paraded at banquets to dance in transparent garments, their bodies displayed for ridicule and titillation. Even girls as young as 7 or 8 were groomed for service, their childhoods shattered in the name of training. But Egypt didn't stop at using women's bodies. It marked them permanently, ensuring their very flesh became a prison no escape could hide. Flesh remembers. And in Egypt, the body itself became the prison. Enslaved women were not only controlled by chains but permanently marked, so escape was impossible even in death. Branding was most common. Heated bronze pressed into cheeks, foreheads, or hands seared hieroglyphs of ownership. The process was slow by design. Skin sizzling, screams filling courtyards, other slaves forced to watch as a warning. Priests sometimes stood nearby, chanting spells to make the pain sacred. Torture dressed as ritual. Tattooing served a different purpose, turning women into living records. Marks indicated origin, skills, even sexual availability. Nubian women were etched with geometric patterns Egyptians deemed exotic. Syrians received different designs. Tattoos clustered on thighs, breasts, and lower backs, positioned to be seen when performing. Archaeologists at Deir el-Bahari have uncovered mummies whose tattooed skin still bears those designs 3,000 years later, proof that humiliation was meant to last beyond death. Other marks disfigured through absence. Egyptian women prized hair as status. Enslaved women often had theirs hacked off with dull bronze blades, leaving cuts and scars that made regrowth patchy. Some owners rubbed corrosive substances into scalps to kill follicles permanently, then tattooed bald heads with ownership symbols. Even in a crowd, these women's status screamed from their bodies. Whips wrote their own language across backs. The hippopotamus hide lash raised thick welts. Reed whips cut thin parallel lines. Knotted cords left circular burns. Overseers could read a slave's history in her scars. Pharaohs carried ceremonial versions of the whip, the nekek, as symbols of kingship. What museums display as regalia were instruments of torture disguised as authority. Even ears and teeth were altered. Large piercings allowed locks to be fixed through earlobes, flesh tearing under weight until ears split apart. Bronze files reshaped teeth into patterns identifying women by owner or region, leaving them hypersensitive for life. Every meal, every sip of water sent pain shooting through nerves. Some markings were sadistic parodies of beauty, scars inked into forced smiles, colored sand rubbed into wounds to heal as raised, tinted patterns. Bodies turned into art pieces of ownership, but these mutilations were only preparation. Egypt made humiliation public, transforming private agony into spectacles for crowds to consume. In Egypt, humiliation wasn't hidden. It was staged. Parades, festivals, ceremonies where women's degradation became public theater. When Pharaoh returned from campaigns, the victory processions began. Captive women were arranged by ethnicity, beauty, and youth. Some stripped naked, others painted with symbols of defeat, their hair shaved or twisted into mocking styles. The route wound through bustling markets, past temples, across palace squares, every step designed to expose, to remind the crowds of Egypt's dominance. People jeered, spat, threw food. Merchants eyed them like livestock. Priests declared their capture divinely ordained. Temple reliefs at Karnak and Luxor still show these scenes. Rows of bound women carved smaller than Egyptians, children clinging but separated by ropes, anguish etched into stone. The art wasn't ashamed. It celebrated the suffering as proof of Pharaoh's might. Festivals carried the cruelty further. During the Opet festival, foreign women were forced to dance their native dances while crowds mocked and pelted them with refuse. Collapse from exhaustion wasn't failure, it was entertainment. At the Feast of Drunkenness, women served wine to revelers who groped and assaulted them openly. Priests framed this violation as sacred service, pleasing to Hathor herself. Competitions turned survival into spectacle. Women raced with impossible loads while nobles wagered on who would fall. They fought over scraps of food. Losers whipped in front of cheering guests. Others were forced to reenact their own capture, dancing the destruction of their villages, their own enslavement. Trauma turned into choreography. Punishments doubled as entertainment. Mock executions brought women to the brink of drowning, strangulation, or fire, then revived them for repeat performances. Public whippings stripped bodies and dignity alike. Pregnant women were examined in town squares, physicians shouting intimate details to laughing onlookers. Even childbirth became spectacle, with households gathering to watch enslaved women labor in courtyards, betting on outcomes as if on horse races. Some rituals disguised sexual violence as piety. At harvest festivals, women were laid in furrows while priests performed fertility rites over them, their bodies symbolically plowed. Children watched these scenes, taught that foreign women were soil, property, less than human. Even death didn't end the display. Corpses were left in degrading poses, salted and preserved for extended exhibition. A woman's humiliation could outlive her breath. Yet the deepest cruelty was not the spectacle, it was the denial of peace afterward. In a land obsessed with the afterlife, enslaved women were condemned to none. In Egypt, death was supposed to be release, tombs lined with treasures, bodies wrapped in linen, souls guided by spells into eternal fields of reeds. But for enslaved women, death was just another cruelty, an erasure so complete it condemned them to nothingness. When a slave woman died, her passing was recorded like a broken tool. A papyrus from the 20th dynasty reads, "The Syrian woman called Small has died. Replacement requested for grain grinding." 30 years of agony compressed into one bureaucratic line. No name, no burial, just disposal. Excavations near pyramid sites reveal mass pits filled mostly with women's skeletons. No grave goods, no careful positioning, just bodies tossed like waste. At Amarna, archaeologists found a cemetery where 60% of the skeletons were female, spines crushed, teeth worn flat, bones fractured and healed wrong. Yet what's most haunting is what's missing. No mummification, no charms, no hope of afterlife. Egyptians believed that without proper rites, the soul vanished. These women weren't just killed. They were erased from eternity. Some were denied even burial. Abandoned in deserts during plagues, left to die alone under the sun. Pregnant women who perished in childbirth were burned, their ashes scattered, seen as spiritually contaminated, not worthy of soil. Corpses from accidents were dragged aside, blood mixed into mortar, their very essence built into walls and pyramids. Chemical tests of pyramid mortar have even found traces of human blood, silent testimony that women became part of the structures themselves. And when women grew too old to work, their end could be merciless. Some were locked in storerooms to starve, others slain quickly, throats cut like livestock. Mass graves show clusters of female skeletons, evidence of periodic cullings when slaves were too many or resources too few. Even in rare cases of mummification, women were preserved as lesser. No amulets tucked in wrappings, no spells written on linen. Some were buried in kneeling or prostrated positions, frozen forever in servitude. Their bones tell us they were forced into postures of obedience even as rigor mortis set in. But the most chilling fate came in the earliest dynasties, when enslaved women were not just denied the afterlife, but sacrificed to serve their masters in eternity itself. Travel back to Egypt's first dynasty around 3000 BCE. At Abydos, archaeologists uncovered something that still shocks modern eyes. The tomb of King Jair surrounded by 318 other graves. Most of those buried? Young women. They were not honored courtiers choosing loyalty. They were slaves killed to serve their master forever. The evidence is chilling. Some bodies show traces of poison, perhaps opium-laced wine. Women lulled into drowsy compliance before death. Others bear strangulation marks on their neck bones. A few show cut throats, the kill swift but brutal. Rows of skeletons laid neatly beside the king's chamber, attractive young women nearest, likely concubines for eternal pleasure. Beyond them, servants buried with grinding stones, cooking pots, tools, so they could keep laboring in the afterlife. Older women further out, perhaps designated overseers. Later dynasties replaced these mass sacrifices with shabti figurines, small statues meant to magically come alive as servants. But the idea lingered. Even in death, slaves must serve. Some women's corpses were kept preserved in storerooms, waiting until their master died, then interred with him like delayed offerings. Archaeologists have even found skeletons sealed alive inside passageways, hands clawing at stone walls, suggesting some women were entombed breathing, left to suffocate in darkness so royalty would not go alone. Royal women demanded the same. Queen Amenhotep's tomb contained several young females buried alive, their final moments frozen in desperate postures, scratching at sealed doors. Some children as young as 5 were sacrificed, dressed in miniature adult clothing, buried to serve as eternal attendants. Texts buried with pharaohs include spells for controlling servant spirits, evidence that even priests feared the revenge of these murdered women. The solution? Magic incantations to bind their souls to obedience. Slavery extended beyond the grave. The practice faded, not from morality, but economics. Killing hundreds of workers for each tomb wasted valuable labor. But the concept survived in subtler cruelties, forcing living women to pose for servant paintings, or donating their blood and hair to craft shabti figurines, ensuring part of them was enslaved forever. In a culture obsessed with eternity, enslaved women weren't promised peace. They were condemned to serve in life, in death, and in whatever lay beyond. The weight of eternity wasn't abstract. It was lived in terror. Enslaved women knew death offered no release. Some were sacrificed outright. Others were stored like possessions waiting to be buried with their masters. And still others were slowly consumed in the building of tombs themselves. At Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, enslaved women formed a silent backbone. They hauled water, cooked meals, cleaned tools, bore children who would one day inherit chains. When a royal tomb was finally sealed, some of these women were sealed inside, whether by accident or design is debated, but their skeletons tell the truth. Bodies curled in corridors, hands clawed against limestone. They died suffocating in darkness so their masters could rest in light. Texts reveal how precise this cruelty could be. If a pharaoh or noble was near death, terminally ill slave women might be kept alive artificially, force-fed, chained, waiting, so they could be killed at the same moment, ensuring synchronized entry into the afterlife. Timing mattered. The master could not go unaccompanied. Even children weren't spared. Skeletons of young girls, some no older than 6, dressed in miniature finery, painted with cosmetics, laid at royal sides. They weren't daughters. They were offerings. Eternal playthings buried alive or poisoned to ensure kings and queens would not lack entertainment in eternity. The horror wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Selected women were isolated before sacrifice, given better food, bathed, clothed, told it was an honor to die for royalty. They were forced to recite prayers thanking the gods for their fate. It was grooming for murder disguised as privilege. Scratches on tomb walls show that not all submitted. Some fought back, their arms bearing defensive wounds. But resistance was futile against the machinery of ritual death. Even when human sacrifice faded, echoes remained. Shabti figurines were sometimes crafted with real women's hair or blood mixed into clay. So even if alive, a piece of them was condemned to eternal servitude. Egypt found ways to stretch slavery beyond the limits of life itself. And yet the story doesn't end there. Because the sands preserved something Egypt never intended. The bones of the forgotten, whispering truths the monuments tried to silence. Her bones still speak. The Nubian teenager we met at the beginning, 15 summers old, dragged in chains through Thebes, was eventually found again. Archaeologists uncovered her skeleton in an unmarked pit near the noble estate, where she spent 4 decades grinding grain. Her knees locked at 90 degrees, fused from years of kneeling. Her spine compressed and twisted from endless grinding motions. Her teeth worn flat by stone dust mixed into flour. Arms showing fractures that healed wrong, evidence of injuries ignored. She lived to 55, a long life for a slave. But long didn't mean merciful. Every bone records pain. Every joint is a fossil of exhaustion. No Egyptian scribe wrote her name. No priest prepared her body. No amulets accompanied her soul. She existed in records only as a number, yet her skeleton now testifies louder than temple walls. This is the cost of Egypt's glory, and she was only one among millions. Women whose blood mixed with mortar, whose children inherited bondage like eye color, whose bodies were consumed and discarded with less reverence than Egyptians gave to cats or cattle. Their existence erased so thoroughly that we recover them only through fragments, a line in a tax list, a painted figure holding a fan, a skeleton bent in servitude. Stand before the Great Pyramid and look again. Each stone represents untold hours of women hauling, cooking, weaving, birthing, suffering. Walk through the Cairo Museum and realize every golden mask, every fine linen robe, every jeweled ornament was shaped by enslaved hands. The columns at Karnak, raised by women carrying basket after basket of dirt until spines snapped. Hieroglyphs scholars celebrate, carved while enslaved women held scaffolds steady in the heat. Egypt gave the world writing, mathematics, medicine, architecture. But these gifts were purchased with the humanity of enslaved women. Civilization's brilliance was built on their darkness. Their absence from tombs, texts, and art wasn't an accident, it was policy. To admit their suffering would unravel the ideology of divine kingship itself. So they were erased. But bones don't lie. They remain as evidence, silent but unyielding. Modern Egyptology has long celebrated pharaohs and pyramids, golden masks, and temples. But for centuries it ignored the invisible millions whose labor and suffering made that splendor possible. Only now are archaeologists studying workers' cemeteries, cataloging trauma in female skeletons, asking, where are the women in the record? The answers are emerging. Grain dust in teeth, whip scars etched in bone, blood proteins mixed into mortar. Each discovery pulls another erased life back into history. The Nubian girl whose knees fused from 40 years at the grinding stone now sits catalogued in a museum drawer as specimen A7892. Even in death, she is reduced to a number. Scientists can tell us she bore children, that she lived malnourished, that she endured chronic pain. But they cannot tell us her dreams, her laughter, her memories of home. That inner world is lost forever, erased as thoroughly as her name, and yet, even without words, her bones speak. Every fused joint is a sentence. Every fracture is a paragraph. Together they form a testimony Egypt never intended to preserve, that its glory was built by consuming women's bodies, breaking their spirits, erasing their humanity, and denying them peace in both life and death. So when you stand before the pyramids, see more than stone. See the women who hauled the baskets, cooked the meals, raised children who would never be free. When you admire a golden mask, remember the women who mined the ore until their lungs collapsed. When you trace hieroglyphs, remember the women who steadied scaffolds while their own names were never carved. The sands of Egypt hold more than treasure. They hold the bones of women whose humanity was denied, but whose suffering made civilization possible. Their voices were silenced in life, but archaeology is giving them back a whisper we cannot ignore. If this story has shifted the way you see history, don't let it stop here. There are countless more shadows to uncover. Click on the video appearing on your screen to explore another hidden chapter history tried to erase. And if you found this journey as powerful as I did, subscribe so we can continue peeling back the layers together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard and remembered.